Hello. Ooh, here we go. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome and happy Women's History Month. Yeah. My name is Lainey Rose, and I'm the events manager here at City Bookshop. It's wonderful to be with you all today. And as we come together to celebrate becoming Madam Secretary. Thank you for being here in person and for tuning in to our live stream if you're watching that way. Our calendar is always full of events here at City Bookshop, and we have a couple other events coming up at the end of the month that I think you would find interesting. On March 25th, we'll be hosting Robin Peguero for his book, One in the Chamber, which is a thriller set on our very own Capitol Hill, involving a Supreme Court nomination and a murder on election night. Then later in the week, we'll be closing out Women's History Month by hosting an event for Can't We Be Friends, a novel of Ella Fitzgerald and Marilyn Monroe, with author Denny S. Bryce in conversation with Victoria Christopher Murray. Before we get to tonight's event, some housekeeping details. Number one, if you could take a moment to silence your cell phones, we would appreciate it. Number two, if you need a restroom, it's upstairs past the cash registers and the greeting cards. Number three, we will have time for questions tonight for both in-person and virtual attendees, so even if you're watching via Zoom, you can participate. Please put those questions in the Q&A feature so that we can read them and can ask on your behalf. And finally, most importantly, if you need to purchase a copy of tonight's book or a copy for a friend, a loved one, a family member, we have those copies available and we'd be happy to help you out. They are available upstairs at the register and can be purchased prior to the signing line. I think there is no better way to celebrate Women's History Month on Capitol Hill than taking a moment to celebrate the women that have come before us and walked through these marble halls on this glorious hill and dreamed of a better future for our country. And what better way to start than becoming Madam Secretary? Frances Perkins arrives in New York City at the turn of the century with an unyielding determination to make a difference. But when Frances meets a young lawyer named Franklin Delano Roosevelt at a tea, sparks fly in all the wrong directions. Neither knows it yet, but over the next 20 years, they will form a historic partnership that will carry them both to the White House. Frances is destined to rise in the political world dominated by men, facing down the Great Depression as FDR's most trusted lieutenant, even as she struggles to balance the demands of a public career with marriage and motherhood. And when vicious political attacks mount and personal tragedies threaten to derail her ambitions, she must decide what she's willing to do and what she's willing to sacrifice to save a nation. Our author of the evening is Stephanie Dray, a New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today best-selling author of historical women's fiction. Her award-winning work has been translated into many languages and top lists for the most anticipated reads of the year. She lives in Maryland with her husband, Cass, in history books. Please welcome Stephanie Dray. There she is. And joining her in conversation is Nancy Altman, who has a 45-year background in the areas of Social Security and private pensions. She is president of Social Security Works and chair of the Strengthened Social Security Coalition. Please welcome Nancy. More round of applause.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. And first of all, I was fortunate to get an advance copy of Becoming Madam Secretary, and I could not put it down. It really is so engaging. So I urge everyone to get a copy and read it. And in fact, that sort of starts me on my first question. I thought it was a really ingenious, clever idea to do a fictionalized account of an historical figure. And I know that, Stephanie, you've done a number of women. It's always women, which I like. And the nice thing about it being fictionalized is that you can imagine their thoughts. I mean, it is very, very well researched. There are, I knew a lot about Frances Perkins on my own book because I wrote my own book about the history of Social Security, but I learned a lot from Stephanie's book. So my first question is, how do you choose who you want to write about? How did you select Frances Perkins? And tell us something about the history that you do, the research you do to write it.
Hello, everyone, and I'm going to answer a question now. I just want to make sure this is working. Great. I chose Frances Perkins because I'm always looking for strong women heroines who are underappreciated in history. And I love to write about the rise and fall of republics. And so at first, maybe Frances Perkins doesn't maybe fit that bill. People might think she's not maybe a revolutionary woman. But as I really took in sort of the big scope of her career, I realized that not only was she a revolutionary woman, she was a founding mother of America in the 20th century. And so she didn't build America or help build America, but I believe she helped rebuild America. So that was really fitting for my brand and what I like to write about and what I want to call attention to. And I'm gonna meander a little bit into personal history here. I had known about Frances Perkins. I knew who she was, but I didn't ever really think of her as a young person. I never thought of her as anyone except for this sort of stodgy, maternal looking Secretary of Labor that we know from the history books. That was a huge oversight on my part. When I was researching the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and I stumbled over a very young Frances Perkins, who was actually an eyewitness to that event, it just struck me, oh my gosh, of course she was young once. And she was this sort of fashionable, plucky, daring woman. And that's the kind of heroine that we should read about. And to see how she seasoned into becoming what I believe is the most important woman in American history. And I will die on that hill. and, and I think that once you read this book, you're going to climb up on that hill with me and mount the cannons. And so you wanted to know also a little bit about the history of how I sort of researched the book. Normally, I like to visit the sites of a historical heroine that I might be writing about. For example, when I wrote America's First Daughter with my dear friend Laura Camoy, we went to Monticello. We made menaces of ourselves while we were there, climbing around in graveyards and visiting Tuckahoe Plantation and squealing every time we saw something that once belonged to William Short, who nobody knows, but we knew about. But in this case, with this book, I started this book in March of 2020. So suddenly I could not go anywhere and couldn't see anything. And I had to rely mostly on the digitized records that were made available by Columbia University. Thankfully, for all Americans, they have digitized about 5,000 pages of Frances Perkins's oral history. And even though I don't remember everything that I read, I did read all of it. So yes, Frances, I did. So I hope that I, did sufficient research for the book, and I can't wait until I get to visit some of the sites because I have not yet been to some of them. But I'm really happy with the way it came out. I'm very proud of the work.
So have you been to the Frances Perkins Center, which is the homestead in Maine?
I have not yet been there, but I have talked to their director, who has been very helpful and very supportive of the book.
Yeah, because this is a place, well, you should describe that she used to go to every summer.
So Frances was not really a creature of DC, even though she did spend much of her time here. She was our longest serving Secretary of Labor. So she was here, I think, 12 years. She loved to go back to her home in Maine. It was the family homestead. It's where her grandmother sort of gave her a lot of great advice when she was growing up, and where she learned all the family legends that sort of bred patriotism into her bones. So she often would return there for solace. And after very hard sessions of working with Congress, she might go there and just fall into bed and not get out of bed for days. So that was her way of recharging. So that seems like a spiritual journey that I should go. I want to commune with Frances there.
You definitely, I mean, all of you should. It's the original homestead, and Frances Perkins' grandson, who I think you've talked to, Tomlin, who is involved both in keeping his grandmother's legacy alive and keeping Social Security strong. He's in the fight. And he turned it. Oh, okay. And so he and others took the homestead and transformed it into a nonprofit Frances Perkins Center that keeps her legacy alive. And they give out awards every year. And she was known for you can describe it, and you should tell the story of the three-cornered hat. So
Yes.
this is, it's called the Steadfast Award, which I received. I was honored with, and it was because when she was a college student at Mount Holyoke, I think their graduating class was Be Steadfast.
Be steadfast, yes. And the tricorn hat is great for a number of reasons. Frances tells a story where she says that she always wore a tricorn hat because her mother told her that she was basically unattractive and that that the tricorn hat was the only shape she could get away with. So that's what she says, and she's generally an honest person, so I believe her. But I also know she's a very political person, and that she would never allow the symbolism of a tricorn hat to pass her by. She had revolutionary ancestors. She claimed Mercy Otis Warren as one of her kinswomen, and she liked to sort of remind Americans that she was from that revolutionary stock, and also that she believed that the reforms that she was working on in the United States were part of it. They were sort of an outgrowth of the mission of her revolutionary ancestors. And this is something that I want to ask Nancy. I think you may have written a foreword to a book about Thomas Paine and yes, can you talk to us about the revolutionary roots of Social Security that drove Frances to sort of use this sort of symbolism and bring that social program to America?
Yes, the idea of social insurance and this collective work for economic security goes all the way back to Thomas Paine, agrarian justice, where he thought that when children reach maturity, they should be given a substantial amount of income, of money, so that they could get their start in life. Wouldn't that be nice today? Instead of graduating with student debt, you'd be given money at the start of your career. And he also thought there should be old age pensions. And you know how he thought they should be financed? With a wealth tax or an income or an estate tax. So he was an estate tax. So he was, and so this was an idea that you know, and now I'm going to digress a little bit, but you know, that the idea of impoverished old age, that did not start with the Depression, although it of course grew much deeper. That people generally, there were poor, literally poor houses, but most people, when they couldn't work any longer, they went to live with their adult children. So hidden in the statistics of the Depression, you know, 1/3 out of 4 were children, of course, but also aged parents. And this really, and I think that one of the big differences between the Great Depression and the Great Recession of, I guess, a little more than in 2008, was that in the recession, we had Social Security. So during the Depression, people were thrown out of work, and that meant the older people were thrown out of, they had no income because they were generally had no income other than from their children. With the Great Recession, it was the opposite. The adult children might be out of work, but the grandparents were getting their Social Security and could help those. I mean, it really was revolutionary. And talking again about the three-cornered hat, you know, I was looking at, so I think, didn't she say someone wanted to take it off and she said, I was born with this hat? I think that was a great story.
She teased that she had been born with her hat on. So she was not going to conform to the conventions of the day.
But you know, it was interesting because I was looking at those pictures and there were a lot of, you know, all the men were wearing hats too. They were, you know, the men, and she was the one woman in the photograph. And the interesting thing, and I was saying this to Stephanie, that it's important to have a context when you're living through the history. You know what's going on. You know, we don't know what's going to happen in November. We're at some point in the future, it'll be sort of this foregone fact. And women only got the right to vote in federal elections in 1920. So she was Secretary of Labor 13 years later. She was Alf Landon's appointed to the Industrial Commission in 1924. New York women got the vote to vote in state elections in 1916, but it was only 1920. So it really, it was amazing that how in some ways that we haven't advanced further, but
Yeah. That's always the sad part, but it's Women's History Month, so we're working on it. And that's one of the reasons I'm so thrilled to talk about Frances. And this is sort of another little question I have for you, Nancy. Frances Perkins, I think we agree that she was the driving spirit behind Social Security, but she wasn't the only person who was working to make this happen. And I believe Nancy might have a little photograph to show us.
So these are I did this for a talk a number of years ago. The founding, we can even pass it around, the visionary mothers of Social Security. So
there, I don't know.
You can,
Here you go.
so, and those are only, those are only sung. And the one, that's sort of a subtle exception I take, because the book is not only extremely accurate, everything I know about the history and about Frances Perkins, and I'll explain once it's gone through who all those, or maybe I should, the one in the middle is Frances Perkins, of course, and I will talk about Barbara Armstrong, who really was crucial, and then Mary Dewson and Ellen Woodward. Before there was a solitary commissioner, there was a board of Social Security, running Social Security, board of 3 people. And these were 2 women who were appointed and confirmed by the Senate to be on it. And Evelyn Burns, who, Gina, I think you know, was an economics professor at Columbia and really pushed the notion of social insurance as opposed to means-tested welfare. They were all very, very key. And of course, Frances, and of course, there were plenty of men, FDR and Arthur Altmeyer and others. But the women were very, very crucial. Without them, there wouldn't be a Social Security. And the only little exception I take, and it's not, I mean, as I say, I think Stephanie did a phenomenal job. It is everything I knew about Frances Perkins was right there in the book, and things I didn't know, I learned. So it was extremely well researched and accurate. The one part I take a little exception with is that the politicians, those in Congress, and Franklin Roosevelt and Frances Perkins were, not surprisingly, very focused on unemployment, and they really wanted unemployment insurance. They thought that was crucial, that we had to have unemployment insurance. The old age pensions they thought was important, and Franklin Roosevelt and Frances Perkins had worked on that in the when he had been governor and had gotten pensions through, and had talked about the need for social insurance, so that it was hard to do on a state level. But so they had all these working groups, the Committee on Economic Security, which Frances Perkins chaired. This was in 1934. Franklin Roosevelt wanted legislation introduced, put together a committee, intergovernmental committee, hired lots of staff, had lots of working groups, gave them only 6 months, and they were going to come out with legislation, and it was going to be expansive. Unemployment insurance, old age pensions, disability insurance, universal health care, maternal and child health care. I mean, it covered basically all the economic security you could think of. And Barbara Armstrong, who's one of the founding mothers, she was also notable. She was the first tenured law professor in the country. She was at Berkeley Law School, and she also had a PhD in economics, so also taught economics, and was a scholar, had written a treatise called Insuring the Essentials that looked at all the social insurance around the world. And she was tapped to be the head of old ages. And I don't want to take this over too much, because I could go on and on about Barbara Armstrong, but she was beautiful and feisty and was a typical academic. She didn't care about the politics. She knew what was right, and she was going to fight for it. And she's the reason it's a federal program, not state and local, even the state and federal, even though they were concerned about it. but she came to blows with Ed Whitty, who was the executive director. She used to call him half witty behind his back. And I could tell you many, many stories about, without her, there would not have been Social Security. She really rescued the old age disability part. And of course, there was also the Townsend movement, which you mentioned in the book too, and was really this grassroots effort that, I mean, at a time without internet, it spread within months to millions of people, Townsend clubs all over the country. They would chase politicians down the street, and literally, and it was really, Social Security wound up being the compromised position, and it really helped its passage.
And this is where writing a novel of fiction is really fun, because a historian like Nancy, she's going to give you the full context of this, right? I am going to tell you Frances's side of the story, and I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt, even when she might be spinning the facts a little, or, you know, she's generally very honest, and she particularly is trying to be honest in her oral history because she knows this is for posterity. But she doesn't give Barbara Armstrong much credit, in part because I think this woman was quite a thorn in her side. And when she thinks of FDR and his support of Social Security, she remembers all the times that he exasperated her by doing things she didn't expect or going around her. So her recollections, you know, I sort of take as gospel in the book as much as I can. Whereas if I were writing nonfiction, I might point out, you know, well, maybe not. She was not above putting political spin on the facts. She learned that from the master, FDR, who was too political for her taste, but she learned a lot from him.
But let me take this in a slightly different direction, because I think one of the parts I really loved about, I loved everything about the book. I mean, I read it very quickly. It was a page turner. But one of the parts that I really liked, I knew a little bit about her personal life. For example, there's a famous photograph of the signing of the Social Security Act, August 14, 1935. And it's amazing that this really happened. But right before she's the only woman, and she's right behind FDR, and they're all looking and smiling. And at least some of the photos, she looks very distracted. Well, it turns out, you should explain why, but before I turn it over to you to say that one of the things that I'd like you to talk more about is that and I think I learned this from you, she was a very private person, and you'll understand why when Stephanie explains. But so there's a lot on the record about her work at the Department of Labor and all of it, and her work with Al Landon, Al Smith, not Landon, he was on the other side, but Al Smith. But she didn't write that much about her family, which was quite troubled. And and the nice thing about a novelized version is you can really think about what it must have felt like to have all of this pressure. It was, you know what these jobs are like, and that was the middle of the Depression. It was a hugely pressurized job. And yet she had all these other pressures in her life too.
Yeah, so this novel, of all the novels that I've written, with the exception of maybe one, I was quite aware of the whole time that Frances Perkins would have hated this. She would not have approved. She would take a very dim view of my digging into her personal life, because she was very private and she did want to protect the privacy of her family. I think, in fact, her grandson very graciously wrote me an email the other day in which he said that he thought she might forgive me because she would understand that now that she was gone, this was for posterity. So I appreciate that. But she had a history of mental illness in her own family. And then she married a brilliant economist who developed what we would now call bipolar disorder. There was no treatment for it at the time. And she had to watch this brilliant man sort of deteriorate to the point where she had to have him institutionalized. And this was a hereditary disease that ultimately came down to her daughter as well. So she was struggling with her husband's mental illness at the same time that she was trying to secure a social safety net for people in the United States. And so on the very day that she was signing, well, she wasn't signing it. FDR was signing it. She was at the signing behind him. And you see that picture of her where she's very strained. It's because she had just learned that her husband had escaped the mental health facility that he was institutionalized in, and he was missing somewhere in New York City. And so she really just wanted to get out of this, get away from the press and the pictures and the lights, and go find her husband and the father of her child. That is a tremendous amount of strain for one person to withstand. And it's just a testament to how strong she was, that not only did this, not get out until much later, but that she was able to fulfill her duties and serve the country so well while juggling these sacrifices that she's making of her family life. And really, that's sort of a theme that runs through the book, is that Frances is always wondering, is it worth it? Is she a good mother? Is she a good wife? And I think she was asking herself that question until the day that she died. They found little scraps of paper where she's wondering if she loves her daughter enough, and if she has done the right thing. And I think that given the talents and the unique position that she was in the country to do things that only she could really advance in that role, that, yeah, it's worth it. Sometimes the sacrifice of your private life is worth it. You see that in many of founding figures. Usually it's the women and children of the great man, right? But this time it's the husband and daughter of the great woman. So this is very poignant to me, and I think will probably resonate with a lot of working women today, how to balance these things, and how your personal aspirations or your public duties might weigh in the balance when you're trying to figure out how to live your life.
And also, of course, she was in a very public job. And you talk about, that, of course, at that time, a lot of there were men's clubs and that sort of thing. There was, and the male journalists, and there were the female journalists. And Eleanor Roosevelt was very adept, as you write, at dealing with the press and really cultivating the women journalists and stuff. But I think, and you, Stephanie, you should talk about, I mean, the sense I get from your book is that because she really did not want anyone asking about her husband, she was living in Washington, she kept her, and we should talk about that too, keeping her name. I mean, for socially, she would be referred to as Mrs. Wilson, or her married name, but she, of course, we all know her as Miss Perkins, which was, I guess, quite unusual for that time. But also the whole, her interaction with the press, I thought was really interesting too.
Yeah, she decided early on that her name, she had been an advocate in the community for years under the name Miss Perkins before she got married, and that was how she was best known. So it seemed like the right thing to do would be to keep her name when she was using it in a professional capacity. But there was an additional reason.
Her husband
That's right. Her husband was serving in City Hall at the time, and he was kind of the opinion of, well, Frances, when you make these crazy speeches, these fiery speeches, it would be great if my name or the mayor's name was not involved. So she kept her maiden name when she was doing public duties. So she went by Miss Perkins, and it was very scandalous at the time. And she even had to sue to be allowed to use her name. But just this morning, someone said, "It's Miss Perkins if you're nasty." It just made me laugh. The original nasty woman. So she was very independent, and she was a trailblazer in so many ways, from keeping your maiden name to being a full-time breadwinner for the family. She was supporting her family. And she was someone who made a lot of firsts, right? She was the first woman to do
And she
many
was
things.
not afraid to mix it up.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, the whole refugees and all of that, I mean, she was, again, I'm really getting this from, I mean, a little bit of sense, but mainly from reading that she always dressed in a certain black, nondescript sort of suit. And it was, I guess, early on, Al Smith said something about, all these legislators' mothers, and she wanted to appear to them as a mother. So,
yeah, she was in her early 30s.
Yeah. Talk about the way that other members of the cabinet treated her and the kind of.
Okay. I'll start out first about her outfits. She started doing this in her early 30s when she was working with Tammany Hall bosses. And this is one of the, I think this is really fun part of the book because I don't want readers to think this is all policy and politics. I love policy and politics a lot, but there's also a lot of other stuff going on, including her real daring. She was willing to go places that no one else would go. There was a portion of her life where she would go undercover to bust pimps and sort of stop, when she was young, to stop human trafficking. So this is back when she was young and stylish. She knew what was what. And she was not afraid to confront employers and embarrass them and make them, pay their employees. And she would go to their landlords even if need be and nag them just to make sure that this person would do what they were supposed to do. She was very fiery, and she wasn't above even confronting Tammany Hall political bosses who were maybe a little unsavory. Let's put it that way. But they had a soft spot for their mother, she decided. And so she could get sort of around being sexually harassed, and she could be taken more seriously, she thought, if she dressed like their mothers. So she gave up her fashionable outfits because there's a great picture of her early in her life where she's got a feather hat. She's all stylish, but no, in the pictures that you will have seen of Frances Perkins, she is a stodgy mom or grandmom. And that was really the impression that I had of her, but that was cultivated. And we were talking a little bit about this in the green room. When you really think about who Frances's friends were and what she liked to do, she's not that stodgy. One of her best friends in the world is Sinclair Lewis, who was a serious cut up, and he would make her laugh. He would make her silly. And so we see, and she loved bourbon and branch water. I mean, she was not a woman who was afraid to party, and she loved the bohemian lifestyle in Greenwich Village. And there's lots of, fun scenes about that in the book. So this was definitely this was an image that she wanted to project. Probably, again, she would hate my going behind it and, unmasking the real Frances Perkins, who was pretty funny, actually, and shared a great sense of humor with President Roosevelt. But yeah, she was not the lady that she would like us to think she was. So
yeah, and I guess one last thing we should go to questions. And that is another thing I was thinking about as I was reading it, is the way politics then and politics now are really not that different. I mean, in some ways they're very different. I mean, it wasn't all the fundraising and all of that, but in terms of, alliances and just all of a lot of what you see today here in Washington, I think a lot of it hasn't changed that much. I mean, your sense?
I don't know enough about about the current political, but I know Nancy does. Yeah. I don't know what has changed. But I do think that what's really fun in Frances's life is I always thought, she's FDR's lieutenant. They're close. They're friends. And they were good friends. But I did not realize that when she first met him, she thought he was a very unimpressive lawyer. And she says, I did not think much of him, but I must be forgiven because really no one would think he would amount to anything. He was called feather duster Roosevelt at the time. So they didn't see that greatness could come out of him. And, he probably thought, like some of her contemporaries, that she was a stodgy blue stocking and do-gooder, insufferable, all that. But they eventually found that they shared a great sense of humor. They shared some political ambitions. They knocked heads a lot in the beginning. She was a thorn in his side and vice versa. And so that was fun to write. That was almost like an enemies to lovers romance, except without the romance part. And I would laughing my head off while I was writing some of those scenes because he was insufferable at times. And seeing the evolution of FDR in this book and how he changed as a result of Francis believed that polio transformed his psychology. There are people who dispute that. They think that Eleanor had a big impression on him much before that, but according to Francis, life gave him a big knock behind the eyes and between the eyes, and it woke him up to suffering in the world. It made him more compassionate, and it made him more self-reflective. And she admired that. She really admired his strength to keep going at it, to get up off the ground and wheel his way or crawl even if he needed to. And I think he admired her for her nobility, and also because he was who he was, which was a cagey operator. He trusted Frances because he knew that she was the only member of the cabinet who would never challenge him for the presidency. So if politics have changed, maybe that's one good thing that have
Here's
changed.
another way they've changed, though, and that is that people at the time, the press did not reveal and take photos of him in his wheelchair, and so and it never came out in the press, I don't think, that her husband had bipolar disease and was institutionalized. So for better or for worse, that is quite different. But we could talk about this forever, but we really want to hear you all have
questions. Oh, yes.
Triangle.
Shirtwaist Factory. Oh.
And is that professional or
no
coincidental or?
So the question is, what was Frances Perkins's connection with the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire? Now, Frances was a young woman living in DC, not DC, New York City at the time. And she had been working on fire safety issues, yes, or as part of her work at the Consumers League. But in this case, and she even had some connection with the women who worked in that factory because they had already been protesting poor conditions. But the way she sort of stumbled on this fire was really as just a citizen of New York. She was at a tea party around the corner and she heard the fire bells go off. And I believe she says in her oral history that she sort of knew in her head which building it was probably on fire. It was probably that one. And she ran out. And of course, it was this horrible, horrible tragedy. And for those of you who don't know, a shirtwaist factory had caught on fire with seamstresses trapped inside the building. I think there were some men in the building too, but this was mostly young women who were left with the choice of either jumping to their deaths or burning alive. And
the doors had been locked. This was a sweatshop, and it was mainly girls and young women, I think 14 to about 24, and they were on the top floors. So even when the fire trucks came and the women jumped, the
ladders weren't tall enough.
Ladders weren't tall enough. The nets wouldn't catch them. This was 1911. So she had been working. She worked in Hull House, and then was working for the Consumers League in New York. And not only did she see it, and it really was galvanizing for the city. It really was the start of her political career, because it was at that point they set up a commission to study the fires and she was appointed to it.
She says that the New Deal was born that day. And some people have taken exception to this because, of course, she was already working on these issues. So how much of an epiphany could it be? But I think Nancy correctly identifies that this is a transition for Frances. She's the idealistic social worker before now. Yes, she's lobbying in Albany. She's learning some of the political ropes, but she's very firmly in the activist side of things. After this, she is now she's sort of an auxiliary part of the government working with this commission to get legislation change. And it makes her connection with Al Smith, who was the head of the committee. And that, really launches her political career. So it is a transition for her. And I think it really galvanized her because she was a very religious person. And I think she was asking herself, why would God have put me right here at this moment, at this place to witness this, if not to use my gifts to change this? And that was something she never forgot.
And it really is, it sounds novelesque. I mean, you've written a novel, but this part of it is factual. And that is really the two incidents. The one that she happened to be just a block away and heard the fire trucks going and the screams and ran out and saw these women jumping out of the window and praying and so forth. And so that was true. That was not made up. That happened. And the other was that her husband had escaped on the day that FDR was signing Social Security into law. It sounds, now I think you did take poetic license and you had Frances and Eleanor meeting in the hospital, and that was, they were sick around the same time, but
yeah,
that was.
Yes, I needed to have them.
License.
Yes, that was poetic license. Their husbands were sick just about the exact same time, and they appear to have been at the same hospital. So there is absolutely no documentation whatsoever of those ladies meeting in that hospital and talking through their woes, but neither of them would have left a record of that. And this is where the novelist gets to play. So thank you. So that was one of my favorite scenes, actually, to sort of imagine. Yes.
What made her into this visionary firebrand? You mentioned it's important, but as a child, what was her upbringing like? How did she, did she see this trajectory for herself when she was a teenager?
I love this question.
Yeah.
In part because I think Frances identified as a crusader from the start. She came from a family I've mentioned their revolutionary roots, but she also had I want to say it was her great uncle. I think that's the right relationship. General Howard. And he started Howard University. He was a Union general. And she was helping write his memoirs while she was a child. So she was thinking about not only her family's role in founding the country, but then in refounding it after the Civil War. And the family was very proud of their role. And so this sort of came natural to her. And then Theodore Roosevelt gave an inaugural address where he essentially called out people whose families went back to the Mayflower, essentially, and said, look at what industrialization is doing to this great land that we have been blessed with and that we have prospered in. And those of you who have prospered have a responsibility to help lift this country out of the problems. And she took that as a sort of a call to action. And that was even besides the moral calling that she felt in her religion. She converted to Episcopalianism when she was out of college. Her parents were Congregationalists, and I think she took exception to some of, I guess there might be some Calvinist roots there. And I think the idea of predestination didn't really sit well with Frances. And to be fair, it didn't sit well with many of the founding fathers either. So she was in good company there. And I think she had this in her brain and her blood. Her grandmother would always tell her that she had duties. And when the opportunity finally came about, she snatched it up.
And I think there's one other pivotal moment, which you also talk about, and that is she went to Mount Holyoke College. She had a favorite professor who was quite liberal, but she also met Florence Kelley.
Yeah.
And you may want to talk about that.
Florence Kelley. Yeah, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about Florence Kelley, who was an amazing woman. But I shouldn't have left it out because Mount Holyoke is amazing. I went to Smith College, so that's my sister's school. Yay, Mount Holyoke. All right.
No, but Florence Kelly was, I guess, a generation older. Along with Jane Addams, helped to found Hull House and was very into settlement and anti-poverty. And she came and spoke to Frances Perkins' class, and it changed. It was, I tell younger people, and I guess we've all had that experience of something that just seems, happenstance, and it can really transform your life. And I think that really inspired her to go, and she wound up working for Florence Kelly in New York. I mean, it really propelled her. And she always felt that, sort of Florence Kelly was looking over her shoulder, that Florence Kelly had felt not successful because she'd been trying, 54-hour work week and all of these things. She was really pushing hard to get, which she did not achieve. But then Frances Perkins was able to achieve it and gave her credit, even though she was no longer with us.
Oh, yes, in the back.
Dedicated your
He was an amazing cat, to be fair. Yeah. Go ahead. Did you have I didn't hear the question. I cut you off by accident. Sorry. Was there a question, or you just noticed that? Well, thank you. Yes. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Mhm. Mhm. So the question is, how do I decide which part to fictionalize and which part to sort of stick to the record? With books about historic figures that I think are still relevant in our current political debates, I really try to err on the side of being super accurate. Now, I also wrote about Cleopatra's daughter, and that was 2,000 years ago. So if I slandered the emperor, I do not feel badly. I don't think it's going to cause any modern problems. But when it comes to more modern history and to founding figures, I try to stay close to the record. So my rule is I generally will not go against what anything in the historical record says. But if there's a conflict, for example, the newspaper says one thing, but my heroine says something else in their memoirs, I'll take the heroine's point of view, unless I find absolute evidence that they're totally wrong. And then, of course, there's all the blank spaces where we just don't know what happened. And I love those. Those are delightful. Then I get to fill things in and give my best guess. And this is one place that I think historical fiction is different than, it's different in many ways than nonfiction biography. But a nonfiction biographer has to generally be fair. I don't have to be fair. I can take a side and just press home that argument, like the lawyer that I was for like 10 minutes before I became an author. And that means that there can be many other novels about the same person, and they'll all have a different point of view. And I think that actually gives you a really well-rounded impression, and you can choose what you think is the truth. Now, I'm wondering if Nancy got jealous ever in reading the novel, because she writes nonfiction, and she was like, "Oh, I wish I could have, just gone to town and taken all the liberties."
Definitely not jealous, but impressed.
Oh,
I have a
yes.
question for,
Okay.
our audience.
Mhm.
So, this commenter says, really appreciate your extensive research and the informative author's notes. how did you know when it was time to stop researching and start writing?
I never know when to stop. Uh, Sometimes interventions have been held. Usually my editor says you have a deadline and I assume you would like to get paid, so you had better finish this novel. And that is usually what makes me stop. And we were actually talking in the green room about how I would have actually liked to interview more figures who knew Frances Perkins, but I was on deadline and I also knew that the information that they had might not be as relevant to the parts of the story that I was telling. So sometimes I have to make those judgment calls and just sort of cut things off. Otherwise, I would love to be down in the rabbit holes learning all the weird facts. I could spend all day down there, but alas.
Do you go back and forth? Or do you like research and then you start writing, or do you research and write a little and then go, oh, I need to know more about this? Or how do you?
I start by, reading the biographies to get sort of an overview of what the person's life is. If there is a biography, there are heroines like Eliza Hamilton and My Dear Hamilton. There is no biography exists. And also Patsy Jefferson, at the time we were writing the book, no biography exists. There are a couple now that are really good. But in this case and some others, if I have a biography, great. That gives me the overview. Then I start outlining the story, what I think are the important sort of thematic beats, because a real person's life does not make a nice narrative arc, right? There are boring parts in a person's life, and no one wants to read the boring parts. And also, you can have coincidences in real life where something happens and it means nothing. Can't do that in a novel, or else you'll get trolled in the reviews. So you have to, sort of hammer it into shape. So once I have sort of a shape figured out, then I have a better idea of what information I need to now go really do a deep dive on. And often I'm wrong. I thought that I was going to spend a lot of time in this novel talking about a failed impeachment attempt against Frances Perkins that happened later in her life.
Another thing similar to
Yes,
today.
yeah.
Today's
Right.
politics.
And ultimately, I didn't want to go there because when I started mapping out the story, I thought I really want to end on sort of the high note of Social Security and this accomplishment and her finally embodying the role of Madam Secretary that she never wanted. She never wanted this job. And if I kept going, then I would have probably had to end on sort of a down note where, yes, she triumphs over her enemies, but it was really spiritually taxing for her. And nobody wants that as an ending to your novel. That's a bummer, especially for Women's History Month. No. So that's, kind of once I have a shape, I figure out what to cut out. Yeah.
I mean, that was another thing
Yeah.
and I wanted to ask you about because I
Mhm.
had a different reaction. And that was, I mean, she claimed she didn't want it and you went with her.
That's right.
My sense of it was she did want that. She didn't want to look like, because there were a group of her colleagues who were really lobbying FDR to get her to be named, and it was clear she was going to be named. So but that is the wonderful thing about a novel. You can present it. Who knows which is right?
She might have been torn, right? Like people feel of conflicted minds, and then when they look back, they choose the story that they think is sort of most acceptable. So she may have been torn, but it is clear that, I mean, she cried her eyes out when she was contemplating taking it. And then she kept trying to resign. And Charlie Wyzanski says that she tried to resign, like a dozen times. So probably a little of both. That's what I would go with.
Well, even then, it
Yeah.
wasn't indentured servitude. So she did not have to have FDR agree.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Mhm.
So, two things. One thing, going back to what you said about Cleopatra and defending you. I just want to say I really admire your ability to evade ancient mummy curses.
So far.
So what you said about how like real people's lives don't necessarily make great narrative arcs.
Yeah.
You have boring parts. I mean, when you're writing not just this book, but in all your books, do you ever find it be like a comforting perspective that because we all go through highs and lows in our own lives? Do you ever think like if something bad happens in your life, you know what, it's fine. This is just one of the boring parts. Like we'll get to the good part. And there have been good parts before, and all these good. Do you ever find that as a comforting?
The question is whether or not I am comforted by the idea that I too might be a protagonist and have and that some of the boring or difficult parts are just part of the narrative that I need to get through. Um, I I I don't know that I've explicitly thought that, but I definitely have taken comfort in perspective. When you're a very young person, especially like say when you're a teenager, something bad happens and you think, and they say, you know, this is the worst thing that ever happened to me. And you have to say, that probably is the worst thing that ever happened to you because you're so young. And so it is terrible, but I promise you, worse things are going to happen to you. So keep it in perspective.
You know, one thing that really struck me as I read it, and again, this is focusing on her private life, her personal life, that we, you know, we live in such a world of celebrity and all these, you know, we know people, they of course don't know us, but and you know, Frances Perkins was Secretary of Labor, first secretary, and all of that. And you'd think from the outside, wow, you know, she has access to the White House, she's in the cabinet, she has all this glamour and how wonderful. But then when you read the account, you know, she has all of this pressure. She's got to work to earn money for the family because, and even then it's very hard for her. It really, I think, gives, it's not just that you see the boring parts. I think you also see the complete person. They're not a caricature. They're not, oh, they're so wealthy. They must be and powerful. They must have just never, ever have problems. Exactly.
You know, just knowing the challenges that, you know, to deal with both professionally, you know, in a man's world at that time and being in politics. And personally, did she have any confidants or, you know, close friends? Were they women? Was it mostly men at that time? Who were those people?
The question is, who were the confidants of Frances Perkins? Were they men? Were they women? How did it go? I know that, you know, I mentioned earlier she was really close to Sinclair Lewis, but I did not yet mention Mary Harriman Rumsey. And for those of you who don't know, she is the founder of the Junior League. She was also the daughter of a railroad magnate. So she was quite wealthy. The sister of Averil Harriman. I'm sorry, Averil. See, I did Averil. See, I don't know the political stuff. With her friendship with Mary, it goes way back, I think, to 1910. And this is an important figure in her life because the friendship lasted 25 years. And also because many people believe that Frances and Mary had a relationship that went beyond friendship. And when I started to write this book, I thought, well, that would be really interesting to write about. So I was kind of hoping that that was true. When I started researching it, though, I did not find much evidence to that effect. And in interviewing her grandson, he was a little dubious, which, you know, isn't always definitive, but he had a very good reason. And it fueled my curiosity about, well, what do I want to portray here? Frances, I am not above writing about the private lives of historical figures, especially if it illuminates their character in any way. But Frances was extremely aware that she was under acute scrutiny by the press and by the public. And she said that she would never do anything, that her enemies were waiting for her to do something that they could catch her out and ruin her with in matters of love, money, or corruption, and that she would never give them that satisfaction. She was also a married woman. Her husband outlived Mary Rumsey. So she would have had to be having an extramarital affair if that were true. And Frances was, as I mentioned, quite quite religious and took a very dim view of marital infidelity. So if I had evidence, I could have in this book accused her of that. But it didn't make sense to me that this woman who was so worried about her image and projecting a blameless exterior for the world because she felt a duty to women in general, it didn't make sense to me that she would do this. And even though I'm not sure if it was true or not, I decided to take her at her word for purposes of the novel. However, if more evidence comes to light, that would be great. And also, I made sure to leave things just a wee bit ambiguous in the story so that readers can make up their own minds about it.
Would you agree that her closest confidants, though, did tend to be women? She was colleagues and worked closely with we all know that, Harry Hopkins and Harold Ickes and others in the cabinet. But it seemed like when she really wanted to talk about personal, it was when
I think that's true. I do think that's true. She did have, and probably going to butcher this name, but Henry Bruyere was her husband's very good friend who helped support Frances, and she did confide in him quite deeply, and I was very sorry to sort of leave him out of the novel, but I had to chop some characters out. And but I think you're right. I think there are a lot more women confidants in her life than men. Um,
Part of it was the suffragist movement.
right.
All of that,
That's right.
bonding.
She was a suffragist. And I think too that Frances was pretty closed mouth with anyone that she might feel vulnerable with. And I think she felt less vulnerable with women. Then you pick. See you. Oh, yay. Okay. Ah. Mhm.
And so there are references
The question is what I came across about Anna Rosenberg. So I did come across her, and I was very puzzled about her because Frances has a very long interlude about her in her oral history, and she doesn't really explain why she is going on about this woman at length. I got the impression from these pages that she did not like her, but I was having a very hard time following why. And then I decided, actually, this happens after my book, so I am going to ignore it. But I did indeed stumble over that. So I look forward to chatting with you after, and you can tell me how awesome or not she was. So thank you guys so much. Thank you for coming out. This was amazing. Thank all of you who are at home watching. I hear we have a big audience. I appreciate this so much. And of course, thank you, Nancy, for having a conversation with me about my launch and this amazing bookstore. I don't know if you have explored it yet, but there are little warrens everywhere where you can get lost. So this is a fabulous night for my launch day. I am so grateful to all of you.
And let me say, well, please, a round of applause. Don't let me cut that off. And let me just repeat what I said at the beginning. This book is fantastic. It's a page turner, and this is a wonderful bookstore. So it's a wonderful place to get your book. And you're supporting local merchants, which is always good. And one final question, and that is, are you now basking in the afterglow, or do you have an idea for your next book? And I urge everyone, I'm looking forward to reading your past books.
Oh, thanks. I am working on a brand new book with my dear friend and sometimes co-author Laura Camoy on a woman who you may not have heard of, Abigail Adams. And it's going to be called A Founding Mother. So I'm really excited about it. And I think Frances would approve of that one.
And thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for being here this evening. We're going to take just a few minutes to reset the space, bring out a little table for signing. If you have not already purchased the book, you can do so with our copies upstairs. Give us just a moment to set up our signing table and we'll be good to rock. Thanks.